Hello, hello! Baldur's Gate has a third child at last. It's been gestating for a few years. You may recall that I made a video about its early access a couple of years ago. I'm also a third child, and much like me, Baldur's Gate 3 spent much of its early life just trying to recover from the trauma of its upbringing before realizing it was allowed to make money. Projection is fun. The gist of that early video was that tabletop and video games aren't the same thing, so you can't make them the same way. I thought I'd chase the white whale algorithm a bit and do some re-evaluation. You know, give it a fat 20k views, earn that sweet $5, thanks YouTube. What's the short of it? Baldur's Gate 3 is probably Game of the Year. 2023 has been a great year for pretty good games, and I'd say this is maybe the best of them. It certainly isn't Tears of the Kingdom. That game doesn't seem to know what minimal UI is, or a story, or long-term engagement. If that comment upsets you, please check out my video, 30 or so things wrong with Tears of the Kingdom. You'll definitely like it. For the rest of you, be aware of two things. One, I often include what I call a filter sentence at the start of my videos to chase away undesirables. I don't know much about Naruto. That is a filter sentence. I love seeing people comment on the filter sentence, as though they caught me, when in reality, they're catching themselves. It's like when people see that my name is Plague of Gripes, and then they leave a comment like, fitting name. Then several of them start making out and high-fiving themselves like I somehow didn't name myself. I wrote the shit. Did you think I didn't know? 2. This is another little gripe. They're videos that are sort of like podcasts in the sense that the background footage is loosely related to the game, but there is not that much editing. Let's face it, you're probably in another tab or looking at your phone by now anyway. You zoomer beastling. Moving on. At the start of my original video, I made it clear that Baldur's Gate 3 was still in development, so I couldn't make final judgments or any judgments at all on certain elements of it. That's still somewhat true, as you can tell that many of its elements still aren't 100% done. It was updated with new content literally this morning. The final area clearly has an entire section that is straight up missing, along with portions of the epilogue, which also affected the stories of a few characters. I expect the developers will continue to amend the game, with small changes for quite a while. Whether or not that involves larger changes or DLC, I don't know. Currently there are no plans for it. But, considering how much money is being sprayed and pumped into this game's every quaking hole, something better be gestating within the next year. What? Point being, I'm gonna judge. My point in the original video was that tabletop D20s are not the same as video game D20s. In tabletop, the GM may decide that they want the players to find an interesting encounter or reward, or the player decides to do something really cool, and the GM wants the player to succeed, because, he thinks it's pretty cool too. The player's roll fail, but the GM either fudges the roll or gives it to the player anyway, or will take the encounter they had planned and just move it somewhere else without saying so. Similarly, even when you fail a roll, the outcome, because you're all playing roles in this role-playing game, may end up being funnier or more memorable than a success would have been. In tabletop, failing isn't the end of the world. The world is in the palm of the GM's hands, after all. The campaign itself is so malleable that even the main story can completely change in the space of a few moments. It's all humans interacting with one another with their imaginations, after all. In a video game, however, there is a static series of assets the developers have made. There are static rooms, static chests with static items in them. There are different outcomes for decisions you can make, but those outcomes are also static. There is only ever as much content as there are prepared, planned assets. Even for something like a roguelike or any other generated game, it's still using a finite amount of assets. When you roll your die in tabletop, anything can happen. When you roll your die in Baldur's Gate 3, either a chest opens or it doesn't. Either you can know the history of an object or you don't. Either you continue a conversation with an NPC or it ends. Either you experience the pre-planned content, or you experience nothing at all. I gave the example before, and I'll give it again. The best game in the world for this kind of stuff is Disco Elysium, because that's a game where you're failing half of the time, and that's the point. Extremely elaborate story set pieces happen on failures and successes, because that's the point of the writing. But not every game can be Disco Elysium, and even Disco Elysium has finite assets. Either you see the asset or you see a different one, or maybe nothing. Did Baldur's Gate 3 fix this problem? No, of course not. You can't fix that. When you get a bad roll in this game, you reload. It became a joke when the game came out that the majority of streams of the game were just the streamer reloading saves. And you reload saves because there's zero value in failing to unlock a chest. There's zero value in your character failing a check and saying, "Oh, nothing unusual here." There's zero value in seeing nothing. And I don't mean a narrative device and allowing characters to imagine the unstated or anything like that. I mean, literally nothing of value is experienced. Like I said before, randomizing outcomes in games is only good for showcasing things that the player may have otherwise not seen. If you make RNG a barrier to seeing something versus seeing nothing, it has no value. Again, let's consider tabletop, actual roleplay. Even failing to unlock a chest in tabletop has value, because the characters can pick up the chest and take it with them. Maybe even put some catgirl ears on it and name it Melissa. Then it has an entire character arc, and Melissa the chest falls on the main bad guy at the end, kills the boss, and it pops open to reveal it was a real girl the entire time. Because you can do that. It's tabletop. The GM and the players can do almost anything. Almost. That's why people play it. Even failures become content. Larian Studios seemed to acknowledge this in the only way that they could. They added a system called karmic dice. I compare this to XCOM, just like I did in my prior video where I called XCOM a slut, which isn't related to this discussion, that's just what XCOM's life decisions were. XCOM is a game that will lie about rolls in the background to ensure you don't hit too often or miss too often. And that's how this system works too. It tries to prevent extremely bad or good sequences of rolls. As a result, most rolls will not be low digit or high rolls. They'll be 8s and 14s and 10s and so on. This eventually benefits your character because as you get stronger, your character has so many modifiers that get added after a roll that you end up succeeding most of the time, until the game decides it's time to lose. And it often does. Does that fix the problem? Oh, no, of course not. People still reload, just not so often. And if the game ends up letting you succeed rolls most of the time, why even have rolls? The answer, of course, is that this is a game about Dungeons & Dragons. Karmic Dice is just an accommodation to make up for the fact that a video game can't deal with this problem. I also got the impression in early access that despite rolling a d20, almost all rolls were below a 10. The game was miserable to play a couple of years ago. It's much better now. I would say this problem is as good as it's gonna get. They probably could have done something like move the failed loot from bad rolls into other areas or made them generated table items, but that would just have resulted in more reloading, confusion, and frustration over not having the thing you wanted right away, and so on. If you're going to make a D&D based game, it's just going to be like this. You absolutely cannot replicate the magic and infinite potential of a tabletop experience in an asset-limited product like this. Not until our mighty AI overlords create generative content that feeds straight through our matrix tubes and into our brains. Wish they'd hurry up with that. I'd be interested to see the data on player behavior in this regard. Do people actually just give up on a difficult roll and move on that often? If they see a locked chest that takes more than 2 reloads to open, do they really just leave? If they pass a mysterious object and fail a roll, do they really just accept you see nothing unusual here and move on? Or, God forbid, switch to a charismatic party member who isn't your created character and let them be the party lead? No, I don't. I'm getting that content. There's a lot to be said here about player psychology, but that's not the point of the video. There's also a lot to be said about how the delivery of the writing has changed, but more on that in a bit. The constant roll failures, and the inability to access content even with your stats maxed out was my main contention of that video. And like I said, it got better. So let's talk about the other contentions that I had. I also talked about the way games used to handle morality systems. Knights of the Old Republic and Mass Effect. Red is bad, blue is good. But sometimes red is renegade and blue is still good. And more importantly, evil playthroughs usually just amounted to kicking babies or stealing pocket change or murdering people for no reason. You know, cartoon evil, not actual evil. Actual evil is so nuanced that humans vilify one another in an attempt to categorize it. But maybe the simplest way to look at it is that evil is the active exploitation of other people or your environment for personal goals, especially when that exploitation harms other people or your environment. Blah blah blah, YouTube philosophy, blah blah blah. In other words, hurting everything around you because you want to and you don't care about that harm. I know, based on prior experience in other videos, that some people get upset at this statement because they want to believe in absolutes, but I'll make it. We made up the concept of evil. It's an evolutionary mechanism to try to ensure cooperation within a social dynamic. Humans survived as a group. When someone harms members of that group, it lowers the chances of the group and species surviving. As a result, we created the concept of evil to explain the more complicated natural reasons for why certain behaviors have no place within society. And boy, there's a lot of gray area and concepts to talk about here. But point being, it ain't rubbing your hands together and going, hee. That shit is funny though. Especially when it's like a little goblin guy, and he's in a dirty muumuu, and you see him dart quickly past a door frame for like a split second, because he's gonna go pull down someone's underwear or mix gerbil turds into their pancake mix or something. But evil is usually more like someone wants power and control over things they normally can't control, so they hurt a lot of people to get it. D&D is famous for its alignment chart of good to evil, lawful to chaotic. So, does Baldur's Gate 3's, that still sounds weird, does Baldur's Gate 3's story reflect that, while avoiding the cartoonish depictions of good and evil, while also allowing you to play the game from any moral standpoint you want? Yes, it mostly does. And I can't overstate what an accomplishment that is. Especially after 30 years of red/blue, Jedi/Sith nonsense in 99% of all games. Sure, Dungeons & Dragons is a bit antiquated in what it thinks evil is, so sometimes you run into monsters, or human monsters, that are just absurdly evil and there's no context for why, which is fair for monsters. You aren't going to question a lion on why it's being problematic. That's just how the setting is, that's how lions are. But as far as player actions, sometimes you can do comically evil things, but usually it's because the victim is someone the player is given the chance to not like, for whatever reason, and so on. And even more commonly, it's because your character wants the power to change things for either the better or their own benefit. Your motivations are mostly internal, so the rationalizations for why you're doing harm or opting for control are left to the secret rooms of your brain, which is how it works in the real world too. A lot of evil people think they're heroes, after all. A lot of them. And the characters in the game don't spend a lot of time discussing good versus evil, just what they want, which is also how it usually works in the real world. There's a definite temptation in writing to have characters anguish over the morality of a moment in time, but how it usually plays out is that in the moment, behaviors seem very rational, and the moral postulations happen afterwards when we or others begin to reframe those moments in an attempt to understand them. Again, this is very hard to do in writing. People and fictional characters are both just walking motivations with their own histories and desires framing everything that they do. Having pre-established traits bring people into conflict is good writing. Having those conflicts be rooted in their rationalizations and circumstances and not just good man/bad man is difficult, and this game does it pretty well. Yes, there's moments where you can wipe out a settlement or threaten a child or murder for no reason. It's in there. But there's enough wiggle room in each scene that no matter what kind of character you're playing as, you can reframe those decisions in any number of ways internally, which is the point. The game knows when to say something is bad, and even then, it gives you a rope out of the scene that's labeled, because I'm not the one doing it. No, when it comes to your decisions as a player, they're sensible, often not always, but are still obviously coded correctly. The alignment chart is there, but so is the roleplay. And usually you don't have to worry too much about committing to a red or blue playthrough. My only criticism here is that certain companions become non-viable based on Act 1 decisions. Through very careful decisions, I got around that problem, but you can still tell that the game breaks a little when you do. It's not written for absolutely everyone to be buddies. Some are evil characters, and others are not that. But it's because the characters have their own internal motivations and rationalizations about the world. It's not because they are good or evil. And that all said, that update I mentioned that happened today, it finally made it possible to recruit that evil character without committing to an evil playthrough. Which is great because I want to shoot that woman in spiderwebs. The police are gonna find her hanging from a lamppost. The story itself also doesn't really hinge on a stereotype of saving the world, exactly. It can, but it can also hinge on your character thinking to themselves, I want me some of that. The key to this is that things are usually happening to you, or are simply in the way. This passive approach to the story means you can establish the outlook of your characters based on how they interpret events. And even when the option for evil behavior is there, there's often some contextual reason for why even a neutral character would be doing it. Not always, though. It would be pretty easy to make a whining, cherry-picking video showcasing all the seemingly overt evil things you can do, but I'm hoping most players would understand how rooted in pedantry that is. I'm not making a 5-hour analysis of morality here. I'm crapping out a YouTube review for $5. Baldur's Gate 3 is written pretty well. That's it. Meh. Adjacent to this, the early access version of the game had a pretty severe issue with most encounters having a correct success option, while the rest were either fail states or neutral. I'm happy to say this is no longer the case. Most of the time you're talking to someone, you instead are given different ways to succeed, or ways to recontextualize the scene. Something Larian said a couple of years ago is that players would usually pick the most sensible option in dialogue, rather than the more interesting but extreme choices. In other words, when you meet someone, if given the chance to try to kill them, insult them, give them 100 gold, or just say hello, most people will just say hello. Because of course they will. The writing in the final version of the game seemed to take this into account as well. Instead of a lot of extreme choices are more probing and exploratory. More realistic. It could be that all this stuff was recorded years ago, and we're just seeing the evolution of the writing from way before even early access. But point being, I can see the improvement. In the earliest versions of the game, the dialogue options felt less like dialogue options and more like a minefield you were navigating. They stopped doing that, and the game is better for it. As far as mechanical stuff goes, the character creator is marginally better than it was, if it changed at all. I wasn't too impressed with it before, and that hasn't changed. It's understandable when you're not only making variants of a lot of different races and species, but they also need to emote correctly, so only pre-made heads. No making Dark Soul 2 Shrek creatures. I say that because, let's be frank, that's mostly what you'd be doing. Oh, me too. God, I want Karlach to vomit when she kisses the thing I made. Oh well. The diversity of what kind of humans you can make, for example, is pretty low, but you can also make a dragon man with a terrible breath attack because they won't buff it, so that's cool. That pre-release version of this game and the tabletop stipulate a lot of limitations and bonuses on every race you can choose. A wise thing that Larian did for the full release was to get rid of most of those. In other words, if you want to make a sorcerer, you don't need to worry about half-elves starting with +2 charisma, especially not if you want to make an orc or something. D&D is very aggressive about hitting stat thresholds, and Baldur's Gate 3 is no exception to that, so ensuring you can play whatever race you want with effectively no impact on gameplay was a good idea for a video game, especially one made during an era where a lot of people are getting into the format. The game also lets you respec your characters pretty easily. All good changes. I love it when games give you an easy, free respec. That's not sarcasm. When a developer says something like, "We want players to have a clear vision of who their character is, so we won't allow respecing," it makes me imagine my fingers slowly snapping shut around their throat. I'm not saying it's a healthy fantasy, it's just to illustrate that they're subhuman, unthinking beasts. The world's so complicated now. The only exception to this are missable stat boosting moments in the game. If you want to max out your stats, it can get kind of complicated, especially if you don't know what those moments are. And once you do, you may feel compelled to make the same choices in every playthrough, since you get nothing if you don't. I consider this a pretty big negative, but again, I don't like missing things. Some people won't care, but it is something that they could have handled better. Don't tie permanent stat buffs to specific choices, kids. Not in a game about role-playing and choices. General gameplay overall is much more enjoyable than it was in the early access, though. It was miserable in early access, mainly because the lack of karmic dice meant you'd be failing very consistently, and because you couldn't get past level 5. So to get through the game, you had to rely a lot on cheesing encounters with mechanic oversights. Shooting people in the back and then crouching, basically. Stealth archers really are the carcinization equivalent of gaming. All shall be crab. My only real combat complaint is how difficult it is to get a build to come together until you're effectively done with the game. Since you can't get past level 12, you don't have access to the things that make classes godlike in actual D&D. That means you're encouraged to multi-class, which is good. That also means you'll probably be respeccing a lot, which is bad. That does help you to try out a lot of new weapons though, which is good. That also means a lot of builds just don't work without those weapons, which is bad. What? Oh, can you leave now? Yes, you can. The game has a few issues, sure, but it recognized its limitations early and worked around them. And it recognized what it did well and focused on that. Larian put the work in, and it shows. A few other games in 2023 have also been mentioned as Game of the Year. Some, like Street Fighter VI, are in a specific genre that probably won't enable that. It's not Starfield. Bethesda is still realizing that all that Skyrim shit destroyed their company, so now they have no clue how to make a game. It's not Tears of the Kingdom. No one reputable is going to vote for that for any reason other than the name. It's certainly not Diablo 4. Spider-Man 2? Resident Evil 4 is just a remake, and I contend it's not as good for the time that it came out as the original, which is, not very controversial. The mid-voice acting doesn't help. I've not played Alan Wake or Control, but I know Alan Wake 2 is supposedly amazing. Check on that. Mario Wonder was apparently pretty good, and Sea of Stars is something I don't know a damn thing about, but it keeps coming up too. Hogwarts Legacy was a good game, but there's a lot of politicking around that. There are a lot of options this year, but yeah, I think Baldur's Gate 3 is the game of the year. And it got there through evaluation and correction, knowing its limits and expanding on its best traits. Not by being perfect, but simply being the best version of itself, which is also how people improve. I wouldn't call my original video scathing or anything, but it was critical, because I'm critical of things I like and want to improve. And damn did it ever improve. Be critical, be kind. Good work, Larian. Still want that upper city, though. Until next time.
Various synthetic psychedelics.
Shit, yeah, baby. It's the party pipeline. Why would you want to shut that down?